These three true Halloween home invasion horror stories are inspired by real events. They happen to a politician, an unsuspecting family, and a woman who thought she was safe in her own bed. First, you will hear from an elderly politician who discovers the man who broke into his home didn't come for candy. He came for him. Then a family who thought they survived a violent roadside attack, only to realize it was a calculated distraction for something much worse happening back at their house. And finally, a woman who wakes to find a terrified stranger hiding in her bedroom, bringing with her a horror that was supposed to stay outside. On Halloween, you lock your doors to keep the monsters out. But these stories prove the real monsters are the ones who find a way in anyway. Subscribe and turn on all notifications so you don't miss what's coming for you next. The year was 2020, the last week of October, Halloween night. The streetlights cast long shadows down the empty sidewalks. Most folks were already inside, the excitement of the holiday over. Inside his house, a politician, a man we will call Croft to protect his identity, was finally getting a moment of quiet. At 79 years old, the chaos of the holiday was a welcome but tiring event. The glow from a carved pumpkin on his porch flickered across the living room, the last bit of festive light in a house that was settling into silence. It was a perfectly normal end to a perfectly normal holiday. Then, a sound that didn't belong. A scuff, the sound of a shoe on the hardwood floor just behind him. Croft turned. The person standing there was a stranger, a solid shape in the dim light, and he was already inside. He stood with an unnatural stillness, his eyes locked on Croft with a predator's unwavering focus. A cold feeling, the kind that has nothing to do with the temperature, washed over Croft. He pushed his chair back, the sound loud in the quiet room. As Croft moved back, the stranger moved forward. This wasn't a robbery. This was something else entirely. The intruder pulled out a handful of zip ties. Croft, even at 79, wasn't about to just let this happen. He tried to resist, but the intruder was a blur of manic strength. He got a couple of ties around Croft's wrists, pulling them tight, but it was a clumsy job. The intruder wasn't thinking clearly. The ties weren't fully secure. He was bound, but not helpless. Then the talking started. It was a rant, a torrent of twisted ideas that spilled out of him. The voice itself was unsettling, shifting from a low, gravelly monotone to a cracking, high-pitched scream with no warning. He paced the room, his voice echoing, talking about how Croft was part of some grand conspiracy. Croft stayed quiet, watching, feeling the plastic of the zip ties digging into his skin. He could feel a little give. It wasn't much, but it was something. In the middle of a screamed sentence, the intruder stopped dead. He stared at Croft, whose silence seemed to trigger something deep within the man's rage. He lunged forward without a word. Before Croft could react, the man's hands were around his throat, squeezing with an adrenaline-fueled strength. All the air left Croft's lungs. The room began to swim, the edges of his vision turning dark. He couldn't breathe, couldn't make a sound. The only thing he could hear was the intruder's ragged breathing, hot against his face. It was pure, explosive rage. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The hands were gone. The intruder stood up, turned his back, and went right back to pacing the room, continuing his frantic rant as if nothing had happened. Croft was left gasping, the sharp pain in his throat a brutal reminder that the line between psychological terror and lethal violence had just been erased. The intruder grabbed Croft by the arm and dragged him through the house. He pulled him toward the back, into the kitchen. And that's when Croft saw his chance. a small emergency alert button near the baseboard on the floor. The intruder had his back turned. Croft, pretending to stumble, dropped to one knee and pressed the button hard with his thumb. There was no sound. He had no idea if it worked. He got back to his feet. Now the waiting began. Had the signal gone through? The house was dead quiet, except for the intruder's muttering. Croft could hear the blood pounding in his own ears. Every second that dripped by without the sound of a siren felt like an hour. He decided he couldn't wait. With a surge of adrenaline, he twisted his hands hard. He felt the sharp snapping sound of the zip tie giving way. He was free. He lunged, tackling the intruder from the side. They crashed to the floor in a desperate, ugly struggle. Just then, the front door burst open. "Police!" The call had worked. Two officers stood in the entryway. The room was chaos. In that split second, the intruder reached for the crowbar he'd been carrying. Before the officers could cross the room, he swung it, striking Croft hard in the head. The impact was a sickening, solid thud, but it was his last act of violence. The officers were on him instantly, tackling him to the ground. The aftermath was a blur of paramedics and police. Croft survived. The intruder, however, would not be a free man again. The case went to trial in 2022. He was convicted on both federal and state charges. The judgment was severe and final. He received a 30-year sentence in federal prison, to be followed by a sentence of life in prison without the possibility of parole on the state charges, to be served at the same time. The legal system had provided its cold, factual postscript to a night of absolute terror, closing the book on the man who brought a real-world nightmare to Croft's door on Halloween. A quiet Connecticut suburb on Halloween night is its own kind of magic. In Darien, back in 2019, the air had that perfect autumn bite, and it carried the smell of dry leaves and wood smoke from distant chimneys. All up and down the streets, you could hear the happy, echoing noise of kids laughing, their costumes making soft, rustling sounds as they ran from one glowing porch light to the next. It was a postcard of affluent, safe American life. For Thomas and Catherine, this was the life they'd built, and nights like this were the reward. Their home, tucked away inside a gated community, felt like an impenetrable fortress. But tonight wasn't about the house, it was about their daughter, Lily. At 7 years old, dressed as a small astronaut, she was completely lost in the magic. Her shyness often made things like this a challenge, but tonight, she was brave. At one house, an older woman with a kind smile waited patiently as Lily took a deep breath and managed a quiet trick or treat. The woman's face lit up, and she dropped a cascade of extra candy bars into Lily's plastic jack-o'-lantern bucket. The small victory made Lily beam for the rest of the block. Thomas and Catherine walked a few steps behind her, just watching. They saw neighbors on their porches waving. They saw groups of teenagers, surprisingly well-behaved, roaming the sidewalks. Everything was exactly as it should be. It was all so wonderfully normal, so completely predictable. This was their world, and in their world, they were safe. After they'd hit every house on their cul-de-sac, Lily looked up, her bucket heavy. "Can we go to the big houses now?" she asked, her voice full of hope. "The ones with the ghosts in the trees?" "You got it, astronaut," Thomas said, smiling. "Let's hit the jackpot." They walked back to their car, the mood light and easy. The first part of the drive was filled with Lily chattering in the back seat, examining her candy under the glow of the streetlights. They talked about which house had the best decorations and whether the giant inflatable spider was scarier than the smoke machine. There was nothing in the world but the three of them in their warm car, moving through a perfect autumn night. It was only after several minutes of driving as they turned off the well-lit main road onto a darker, more secluded street, that the world outside the car began to feel different. The houses here were spread further apart, hidden behind long driveways and clusters of old trees. The sounds of other trick-or-treaters faded away. It was here in the deeper quiet that Thomas first noticed the headlights. A dark sedan, hanging back at a distance in his rearview mirror. He didn't think much of it at first, but when he made another turn, the headlights followed. Now it was no longer a coincidence. His hands tightened on the steering wheel. A cold, heavy feeling started to settle in. He didn't say anything to Catherine, but the mood in the car had shifted from easy contentment to a low, humming tension. He just kept driving, his eyes flicking from the road ahead to the mirror. He came to a stop sign at the end of the dark road. As his foot hit the brake, a second car, its headlights off, suddenly pulled out from a side street, blocking the intersection. They were trapped. The sedan behind them pulled up close, boxing them in. Thomas's heart hammered against his ribs. This was real. Before he could even think, a door from the car in front of them flew open. A figure dressed in black got out and walked toward them. The figure raised a handgun, pointing it directly at Thomas's face through the windshield. In the back seat, Lily let out a small, confused whimper. Time seemed to stop. The world shrunk down to just that dark figure and the barrel of the gun. At that exact moment, from the side of their own car came a sudden, violent pop. It was immediately followed by a loud, sustained hiss. Everything happened at once. The figure with the gun lowered it, turned, and got back into the car. Both vehicles sped off into the night, their tires screaming on the pavement. They were left alone in the middle of a dark intersection, in a car with a flat tire, shaking with adrenaline. Their first thought was just pure relief. They were alive. They thought they had survived a botched carjacking. They thought the worst was over. It took time to get help and talk to the police. By the time they finally pulled into their own driveway, the family was exhausted and rattled, but they felt like they had faced the danger and it had passed. They just wanted to go inside and lock their fortress doors. But the moment Thomas put the key in the front door, he knew. The door pushed open on its own. It was unlocked, and inside there was only darkness. The power was out. A cold dread, far worse than what he felt with a gun in his face, washed over him. They stepped inside. The house was dead quiet. The air was stale and cold, and as their eyes adjusted, they saw the truth. The place was a wreck. Drawers were pulled out, belongings thrown around. In the study, a huge, gaping hole was torn in the wall. The massive 60-pound safe they had hidden there was gone. The horror finally clicked into place. The chase, the gun, the popped tire. It was all a show. A calculated professional distraction designed to keep them pinned down while a second team bled their house dry. These weren't amateurs. The cut power lines meant the security cameras were useless. A neighbor's security camera later showed two figures moving with chilling, fluid confidence. The stolen goods, valued at over $400,000, were never recovered. The suspects were never caught. In a final desperate act weeks later, the family offered a $20,000 reward for information. Nobody ever came forward. Not one person ever called. They were left to live in their violated home, their feeling of security shattered forever. The true horror of that Halloween night wasn't the gun. It was the chilling precision of the people who had selected them as a target and stolen the one thing they could never get back. This quiet of the house was something Danielle had earned. It was the prize at the end of a 10-hour shift of physical work. a deep silence that soaked into her aching muscles. The house itself was old, and it had its own language of noises she knew by heart. The low groan of the pipes in the walls, the click and sigh of the furnace kicking on in the basement. These were the sounds of safety, the familiar rhythm of a home settling in for the night. She'd fallen into bed an hour ago, and sleep had taken her quickly, pulling her down into a heavy, dreamless dark. It was the kind of complete shutdown her body demanded. Something pulled her back from the edge of that deep sleep. It wasn't a noise. It was a change. A subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. The air on her face felt colder, and the familiar, gentle sounds of the house were gone. The furnace wasn't sighing. The pipes weren't groaning. There was only a flat, dead stillness that felt unnatural. She was hovering in that space between sleep and awareness, her body still heavy, but her senses beginning to prickle, telling her that some small, important rule of the night had been broken. That's when the sound came. It was soft, but it was all wrong. A dull, wet-sounding thud from the far corner of the room. It was an ugly, dense sound, like a heavy bag of wet laundry being dropped onto the carpet. Her tired brain immediately tried to explain it away. A book falling off the shelf, a branch tapping against the outside window. But it was too heavy for a book, and it had come from inside the room. The sound didn't repeat. It just hung there in the new, suffocating silence. Danielle's eyes opened to a darkness that was almost total. The only light was a pale, fuzzy rectangle on the floor, cast from the porch light outside her window. It wasn't enough to see by, only enough to turn the familiar shapes of her furniture into vague, hulking shadows. She lay perfectly still, straining to listen. Her breathing was a quiet catch in her throat. Her heart began a slow, heavy beat against her ribs, a deliberate, pounding rhythm that seemed to be the only thing moving in the world. Slowly, carefully, she pushed herself up on her elbows. Her gaze swept across the dark room, cataloging the shadows. The dresser, the closet door, the old, worn-out armchair in the corner. Her eyes stopped there. The shape was wrong. It was too big, too bulky. Her mind, practical and refusing to leap to conclusions, started its checklist. It's the coat she threw there after work. It's a pile of clothes for the wash tomorrow. She squinted, trying to force the shape to resolve into one of those harmless things. But the longer she looked, the more certain she became. A coat doesn't have that curve at the top. A pile of laundry doesn't have the distinct slump of shoulders. The realization didn't come in a rush. It was a slow, cold ooze of truth that seeped into her mind. The shape in the chair was a person. The air in the room became frigid, and a cold she couldn't explain began to creep up her limbs. An intruder was in her room, sitting just 10 feet from where she slept. The questions were simple, direct, and paralyzing. Who is it? How did they get in? She sat up fully, the bed springs making a low groan that seemed to shriek in the silence. The figure in the chair didn't react. Her voice, when she finally found it, was a dry, reedy whisper. "Who are you?" There was no answer, just a small, almost imperceptible movement from the chair, a shiver that shook the entire shape. It was a human motion, a response to cold or fear. Danielle's hand moved, shaking, toward the bedside lamp. Her instincts told her this was a terrible idea, that some things are better left unseen. But the need to know, to face whatever was there, was stronger. She flicked the switch. Light flooded the room, harsh and unforgiving. The scene it revealed was worse than any shadow. The person in the chair was a young woman, maybe 20, and she was soaked through. Water dripped from her dark hair onto the chair, pooling on the floor. Her clothes were plastered to her skin, streaked with mud and grass. Her face was pale, almost gray, with dark smudges of dirt. But it was her eyes that stole the air from Danielle's lungs. They were wide, fixed on nothing, and filled with a kind of blank, animal terror that went far beyond being caught in a stranger's house. This was the look of something that had been hunted. Danielle's first instinct wasn't to call the police. That could come later. The raw fear on the girl's face was a problem that needed a solution right now. She got out of bed, grabbing a thick towel from the closet and a blanket from the foot of her bed. She held them out. The girl didn't seem to see them at first. Then her eyes focused on Danielle, and her mouth opened. The first words came out, broken and chattering. "He was there in the woods. I ran." Bit by bit, the story came out. It was a simple, brutal nightmare. She'd been walking home on the old service road behind the neighborhood when a man had grabbed her. He dragged her from the road into the dark, wet woods that bordered the houses. She fought. She kicked and clawed and screamed, but no one was around to hear. In the struggle, she broke free and just ran. She didn't know which way she was going. She just ran from the sound of him behind her, crashing through branches, slipping in the mud, fueled by pure, desperate adrenaline. She thought she was lost for good. And then she saw it. Through the trees, a single point of yellow light. Danielle's porch light. She didn't know whose house it was. She just knew it was a sign of safety. It was the only thing in the world to run toward. She aimed for it, bursting out of the woods, stumbling across the backyard. The back door, she'd mumbled, was unlocked. Danielle never locked it. She'd collapsed into the first chair she found in the first room she entered, her body finally giving out. The police came. They took the girl's statement, their voices low and serious. An ambulance took her to the hospital, and then they were all gone. Danielle was left standing in her bedroom, the wet spot on the chair and the muddy footprints on the floor, the only proof that any of it had happened. The house was quiet again, but the silence was different now. It was thin, fragile. Every creak of the floorboards, every rattle of the window pane from the wind was a question. The realization settled on her, heavy and suffocating. The attacker had watched the girl run straight to her house. He knew where she lived. Sleep was impossible. But staying in the bedroom with the damp, empty armchair in the corner felt worse. She went to the living room and sank into the sofa, telling herself she would stand guard until sunrise. The adrenaline eventually faded, and the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of her workday pulled her under. She woke with a jolt, her neck stiff, to a room filled with the full, bright light of morning. For a moment, there was just confusion. Then the memory of the night returned. She looked around. Everything seemed normal. The house was quiet, but it was the familiar quiet of a weekday morning. The terror of the night felt distant, like a bad dream receding in the daylight. She pushed herself up, her joints aching, and walked on autopilot to the kitchen. She started a pot of coffee, the familiar gurgle of the machine a comforting sound. She was just a tired woman getting ready for another day. The night was over. She poured the hot black coffee into her favorite mug, the warmth a welcome feeling in her hands. She took a sip, leaning against the counter, letting the caffeine begin its work. Her house was safe. The sun was up. It was over. She took another drink of coffee, her eyes scanning the living room. She was about to turn back to the kitchen when she saw it. The front door. From this angle, she could see the deadbolt. The small metal knob was in the horizontal position, unlocked. A cold dread, sharp and sudden, cut through the warmth of the coffee. She set the mug down on the counter with a loud clack. She walked slowly, deliberately, toward the door, her heart beginning to pound a hard, fast rhythm in her chest. She reached out a single trembling finger and pushed. The door swung inward without a sound, revealing the sunlit porch. It had been left unlatched. It had been open all night. She had been safe, but only because he had decided she would be.